The Secret Duel. Mongkok, 1971. Hong Kong, Mongkok District, July 1971, 11 p.m. The air hung heavy with that sticky humidity that seeps into your bones, mixed with the smell of cheap incense from a nearby altar, and the metallic trace of rain that had just ceased. The streets of Mongkok never fully sleep, but in that specific alley, the silence was so dense you could hear the hum of the electric cables overhead. This was no tournament. There was no press, no 16mm cameras filming for posterity. The wooden doors of the old Kwun were double-locked, barring entry to anyone who didn't have a reason of blood or honor to be there. There was only one rule dictated by the elders: an exchange without protection, without outside witnesses, a family matter that, out of pure pride, should never have left those four walls. What happened on that worn wooden floor could have buried the career of the greatest star Asia ever gave the world, or it could have sealed a legacy we all believe we know today. But the reality whispered by the old masters only when the lights of traditional schools go out is far more disturbing. This is the story that the lineage of the great masters tried to hide for over 50 years. The challenge. It all started 3 days earlier with a letter Bruce should never have answered. But to understand why someone would erase from history an encounter that lasted barely 3 seconds, you first have to understand where Bruce Lee stood at that precise moment in his life. I've spent over 30 years scouring the alleys of Kowloon, talking to men who can barely walk now, but who in their youth moved mountains with their fists. I don't rely on what the movies say or on rehearsed Hollywood choreography. My job is to separate myth from reality, though sometimes reality is far more incredible than any fiction. And what they told me about that night in Mongkok changed the way I see Wing Chun forever. In the summer of 1971, Bruce Lee was no longer the impetuous, brawling youth who had left Hong Kong years ago with barely a few dollars in his pocket. Now he was a rising star, a man on the verge of premiering The Big Boss and already challenging millennia of Chinese tradition with his philosophy of Jeet Kune Do. Bruce said that style was a cage. He said traditional forms were organized despair, and in the heart of the Hong Kong martial arts community, that was a declaration of war. But for the family of Grandmaster Ip Man, the man who had taught Bruce the foundations of everything he knew, the situation was personal. To them, Bruce wasn't a revolutionary. He was a prodigal son who had contaminated the purity of Wing Chun with Western concepts, boxing, and fencing. They saw him as a traitor to the lineage. The encounter. The tension couldn't stretch any further without breaking, and the cord finally snapped during a private dinner. The Grandmaster's daughter was at that dinner. I won't mention her name out of respect for the protocols of silence still maintained by some of her descendants, but she was the guardian of the most orthodox, cold, and lethally precise technique imaginable. While Bruce spoke of flowing like water, she represented the ancient rock that does not move. She issued the challenge, not with shouts but with a cutting silence. If Bruce was so evolved, if his system was truly superior, he had to prove it against the original technique. No cinematic flourishes, just structure against structure. Honestly, no one was prepared for what that invitation hid. Bruce accepted with a calmness that, according to those at the table, deeply irritated the traditionalists. It wasn't the arrogance of a famous man. It was the confidence of a man who had already fought that battle 1,000 times in his mind. 3 days later, Bruce arrived at the Kwun. He brought no bodyguards, no film crew, and wasn't even wearing his characteristic training suit. He arrived in civilian clothes with a simplicity that seemed like an insult to those waiting in perfectly pressed traditional uniforms. The setting was a small hall, lit only by a yellowish bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, deformed shadows on walls filled with ancient calligraphy. The atmosphere wasn't that of a friendly practice. It was that of a trial. The witnesses were barely 4 people. 3 elders from the Wing Chun Association, men who had dedicated 50 years of their lives to repeating the same movements with mechanical precision, and a young assistant barely over 20, tasked with cleaning the floor and serving tea. It was this assistant who, decades later after the elders had passed away, decided to break the silence because he felt the truth weighed too heavily. The trap. The rules they imposed were suffocatingly restrictive, designed specifically to nullify Bruce's advantages. No high kicks would be allowed. There would be no long movements or the boxer's footwork Bruce loved so much. The encounter would be reduced to the purest and most dangerous terrain of Wing Chun: chi saw, or sticky hands. It involved direct forearm contact. A dance of sensitivity and strength where the first mistake means your structure is broken. But the detail no one mentions, the one that truly made this encounter a death trap for Bruce's reputation, was the time limit. They had 3 seconds. Only 3 seconds of continuous exchange for one of them to break the other's guard. If in those 3 seconds Bruce failed to dominate the situation, or if he was forced to take a single step back, he had to publicly admit to the Hong Kong press that Jeet Kune Do was an inferior style, and that traditional Wing Chun was the only source of truth. Imagine the scene. Bruce Lee, the man about to conquer the world, putting his entire career and philosophy on the line for a 3-second exchange in a damp basement in Mongkok. If he failed, his image of invincibility would crumble before it even truly began. The first second, the master's daughter took her place in the center of the room. Her posture was perfect. Her feet were anchored to the floor as if her bones were made of lead. Her gaze wasn't fixed on Bruce's eyes, but on his chest, observing every micro-movement of his shoulders, every breath. She was the embodiment of geometry applied to combat. She wasn't seeking blood. She was seeking to make Bruce lose face, to humiliate him in front of the elders so her father's lineage would regain the respect she felt Bruce was stealing. Bruce approached. He didn't assume an aggressive combat stance. He simply extended his arms, seeking the initial forearm contact. In that moment, the young assistant says the air in the room seemed to vanish. The elders leaned forward in their wooden chairs, eyes wide, holding their breath. This is where the myth becomes reality and where the story told in documentaries begins to fall apart. Because what Bruce Lee did in that moment wasn't fighting. It was something else, something witnesses described as if time had stretched unnaturally. Bruce didn't try to use physical force. In fact, they say his arms felt light, almost weightless. Something that completely baffled the woman who expected a violent clash of energy. She initiated the movement. She was fast, incredibly fast. Her hands moved like snakes seeking Bruce's center, trying to use a direct palm technique to displace him and force that step back that would signify his moral defeat. The elders smiled for a fraction of a second, believing the encounter would end before the light bulb finished swaying. But here is where things get serious. Bruce didn't block the blow. In traditional Wing Chun, you block and counterattack simultaneously, but Bruce did something not found in the manuals. He used what he called the technique of the void. Just as her palm was millimeters from making contact, Bruce offered no resistance. He simply made his central axis disappear. He didn't move backward. He rotated his hips just a few degrees, just enough so that her energy, which came with the full intent of knocking down a wall, found nothing but air. The master's daughter, for the first time in her professional life, lost her balance. It was a microsecond, a stumble almost imperceptible to an untrained eye. But for the masters present, it was as if the sky had fallen. The silence that followed that first second was deathly. You could hear the witnesses' hearts thumping against their ribs. The final 2 seconds. But the encounter hadn't finished. 2 seconds remained, and the reaction of tradition to the void was not acceptance but fury. The assistant remembers the woman's face transforming. Icy calm turned into fierce determination. She knew she had failed the first attempt, and in the world of high-level martial arts, failing the first move is a death sentence. She readjusted her position in a blink and launched a flurry of chain punches, the signature of Wing Chun, seeking to saturate Bruce's senses with a speed few humans could follow. And that was when what should never have leaked to the press occurred. What happened in those final seconds didn't just silence the dojo. It forever changed Bruce's relationship with the Ip Man lineage, forcing a pact of silence that held firm for decades to protect the reputation of a dynasty that simply wasn't ready to lose. Bruce Lee didn't just intercept her energy. He caught her in a knot of arms that seemed physically impossible. But before she could even process that she was trapped, Bruce did something that left the old masters speechless. To understand the magnitude of that final second, we have to step back and see what was truly at stake on that wooden floor. It wasn't just about who was stronger. It was the question Bruce Lee was asking the world. Is tradition worth more than truth? The truth was about to hit them in the face, and not in the way they expected. The air in Mongkok didn't change for the rest of the world that night. But inside that hall, the universe had been completely reconfigured. 2 seconds left. Only 2 seconds for the fate of a dynasty to be sealed in the shadows. The daughter of Master Ip Man was no beginner. She had grown up breathing the dust of the quins and listening to the rhythmic striking of wooden dummies since she could walk. For her, Wing Chun wasn't a sport. It was an absolute geometric truth. When Bruce Lee made his central axis disappear and left her striking the air in that first exchange, something broke inside her. It wasn't her body. It was her certainty. The young assistant, who years later would recount this to me with hands still trembling, remembered that the silence following that first second was so heavy it hurt. The three elders, sitting like judges of an ancient inquisition, didn't even blink, but their eyes, fixed on Bruce, had shifted from condescension to silent alarm. It was a positional error. The assistant shouted in an outburst of blind loyalty. "Repeat it." "He just got lucky." Bruce said nothing. He didn't smile, didn't do his characteristic nose flick, nor did he adopt any of the poses that would make him famous on the silver screen. He just stood there with arms extended, offering his forearms again, but his gaze was different. It was no longer the gaze of a challenger. It was the gaze of a mirror that was going to reflect back to tradition all the rigidity it had created. The woman, driven by a mix of shame and family duty, decided there would be no third chance. She was going to end this in the second round. She readjusted her stance, sank her heels deeper into the wood, and launched what is known in Wing Chun as Lin Wan Kun, chain punches. It is a technique designed to overwhelm the opponent, a storm of direct hits that leaves no room to breathe. But look closely at this point, because this is where history divides in two. In traditional Wing Chun, the logical response would be to block and counterattack, an exchange of force against force, structure against structure. But Bruce Lee was no longer playing by those rules. He had already understood that to defeat structure, one must not oppose it with another rigid structure, but rather become the empty space between the bricks. When she initiated the flurry, the speed was terrifying. The sound of her fists cutting the air was like the flapping of a trapped bird. But Bruce didn't retreat. He didn't take the step back the elders so desperately craved. Instead, he took a step forward, stepping right into the eye of the hurricane. What the witnesses described next will leave you cold. Instead of crashing against her fists, Bruce used a movement that combined lap saw, pulling hand, with an interception that belonged to no manual. In a blink, his arms moved as if they had no bones. He entangled her energy, trapping her elbows in a knot of mechanical pressure that left her completely immobilized for a fraction of a second. And in that precise instant, time stopped completely. Bruce Lee didn't throw a punch. He didn't even close his fist. He simply extended his fingers into a Baiuji spear hand and stopped them 1 millimeter, barely the thickness of a sheet of paper, from the woman's throat. There was no impact, no sound of breaking bones. There was only the icy brush of pure intent. The master's daughter froze. She could feel the heat from the tips of Bruce's fingers against her neck. She knew that if he had decided to follow through with that movement just a few millimeters more, her lineage would have ended right there in that Mongkok basement. Her eyes, which before burned with arrogance, opened with brutal clarity. The fear wasn't for her life, but for the realization that everything she believed to be infallible had just been dissected with the precision of a surgeon. The third second ended in silence. That still resonates within the walls of that building. Bruce withdrew his hand with a softness that was almost more insulting than the attack itself, took a step back, and lowered his arms. There was no celebration, no speeches about the superiority of his style. He simply stood there waiting. The elders did not move. The assistant says that one of them had his mouth wide open, but no sound came out. They had seen the impossible. The perfect system, the technique that Ip Man had polished for decades, had been surpassed, not by a greater force, but by a superior understanding of freedom. Bruce hadn't defeated a woman. He had defeated an idea. He had proven that tradition, when it becomes rigid, becomes its own prison. "Enough," the eldest of the three finally said. His voice was barely a whisper, but in that empty room it sounded like thunder. The master's daughter bowed her head. There was no handshake, no hugs. The respect born in that moment was not that of a friendship, but a mutual recognition of an uncomfortable truth. She retreated into the shadows of the altar, and Bruce, without saying a single word, picked up his jacket from the floor. But here is where the raw truth of the story comes out. Anyone would think Bruce would walk out of there to tell the world of his victory, but Bruce knew something that many of his followers today forget. He still loved his master. He respected IP Man's memory enough to know that publicly humiliating his family would be an act of dishonor he wasn't willing to carry. He approached the elders and, according to the assistant's account, bowed deeply. It was not a bow of submission but of farewell. In that moment the pact was sealed. The elders would not mention the encounter to protect the school's reputation and the Wing Chun teaching business in Hong Kong, which at the time was the livelihood of many families. Bruce, for his part, agreed not to use the event as propaganda for his Jeet Kune Do. That night, Bruce Lee left the dojo and walked alone through the streets of Mongkok under the falling rain. 3 seconds, that was all he needed to confirm his path was the right one. A few months later, the big boss would premiere and the whole world would know his name. But no one would know that his greatest victory had occurred in the darkness of a basement in front of 3 old men and a woman who represented everything he had left behind. The assistant, the only one who dared to speak decades later, told me that what impacted him most was not Bruce's speed, but his gaze as he left. It wasn't the look of a trophy winner. It was the look of someone who had just understood that true mastery does not reside in repeating the forms of the past, but in having the courage to break them to survive the present. Over time, the story leaked out in whispers. The private diaries of one of the elders mentioned an unfortunate encounter that never made it into official records. IP Man's family continued teaching the traditional style, and Bruce continued to revolutionize the world until his premature death in 1973. But those who were in that room always knew the truth. The student no longer followed the path. The student had become the path itself. The problem with a night like that is that it doesn't fit into the normal world. No videos, no audio recordings. All we have left is the memory of those who saw how 1,000 years of rigidity collapsed under its own weight before the fluidity of a single man. The world may doubt, historians may ask for evidence that will never exist. But for those who understand that combat is a language of truth, those 3 seconds are more real than any movie. In the end, the lesson carved into the wood of that dojo is simple yet terrifying for those who seek security in rules. The real enemy is never the opponent in front of you, but your own certainty that you already know everything. Bruce Lee wasn't the best because he was the strongest, but because he was the only one who had the humility to empty his cup so he could fill it again. That night in Mongkok, the door closed behind Bruce, but the breach he opened in the history of martial arts never closed again. The silence of the dojo was the final recognition that evolution doesn't ask for permission, it simply happens, and whoever is not ready to flow is destined to break. The world can continue to argue about lineages and pure techniques, but somewhere in Hong Kong, in an alley that smells of incense and dampness, the echo of those 3 seconds is still felt. An echo that reminds us that true freedom begins where forms end, and what happened there between shadows and promises of silence was real enough to forever change everyone in the room. Whoever saw it could never look at Wing Chun the same way again, and whoever hears it today might understand that Bruce Lee's secret was not in his hands, but in his ability to be nothing so that he could be everything.